Imagine this: a millionaire, away on business for weeks, decides to surprise his family by coming home unannounced. Excited, he walks through the door, expecting laughter, hugs, and the comfort of his home. But instead, he's met with a scene that stops him dead in his tracks, a moment so unexpected, so shocking, that his entire world feels like it's collapsing in slow motion. In the living room, he sees his disabled son, but he's not alone. Standing right there beside him is the maid, her expression unreadable, the air thick with tension. What she's doing and why will leave you speechless. This wasn't just a casual moment, it was a revelation that would change everything he thought he knew. It had been 3 months since Richard Hale last set foot in his sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Atlanta. The gleaming marble floors, the high ceilings, and the panoramic windows that looked out over acres of manicured gardens had always been symbols of his success. Richard wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man whose name opened doors in business circles across the country. Investments, real estate, tech startups, his fingerprints were on all of it. But his wealth came with a price. His life had become a constant string of flights, meetings, late-night calls, and the ever-present glow of his phone screen. And in all that chaos, his time with his son had become painfully rare. Ethan, his only child, was just 10 years old, a sweet, gentle boy born with cerebral palsy. His disability meant he couldn't run around like other kids or speak clearly without effort. But what Ethan lacked in physical ability, he more than made up for with his warm smile and an intelligence that often surprised people who underestimated him. His mother had passed away years ago, leaving Richard to raise him alone. In truth, Richard had relied heavily on nannies, tutors, and a small household staff to care for Ethan when business took him away. One of those staff members was Grace, a tall, soft-spoken black woman in her early 40s who had worked in the Hale household for over a year. She'd been hired initially as a housekeeper, but somehow, over time, her duties had shifted toward caring for Ethan. Richard barely noticed the change. In his mind, she was just the maid. On a warm Friday afternoon, Richard's plane landed earlier than expected. He had decided, almost impulsively, not to tell anyone he was coming back. He imagined walking in, surprising Ethan, maybe taking him out for ice cream before dinner. Guilt tugged at him for being away so long, and he was ready to make it up to his son, if only for the weekend. The black town car pulled up to the iron gates. Richard keyed in the security code, and the gates swung open, revealing the familiar winding driveway. The air smelled faintly of jasmine as he stepped out, suitcase in hand. Inside, the house was quiet, unusually quiet. He expected to hear the low hum of the vacuum cleaner or the clinking of dishes from the kitchen, but instead, there was only stillness. He set his bag down in the foyer and walked deeper into the house. Then faintly, from upstairs, he heard laughter. Not just any laughter, Ethan's laughter. It was rare, precious, and unmistakable. Richard smiled and followed the sound. When he reached Ethan's bedroom door, it was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently, and the scene before him stopped him cold. There, on the plush carpet beside Ethan's wheelchair, was Grace. She wasn't in her crisp uniform. She was dressed casually, barefoot, her hair tied back in a scarf. In front of her was a makeshift fort built from blankets and chairs, and inside the fort, Ethan was lying on his stomach, propped up on pillows, giggling as Grace read from a brightly illustrated book. But she wasn't just reading, she was doing all the voices, complete with sound effects, and every so often, she'd pause to tickle Ethan or make a silly face. Richard froze in the doorway, unsure what to make of it. His first instinct was confusion. Why was the maid sitting on the floor with his son, playing like this? Why was Ethan, who usually seemed withdrawn around him, laughing so freely? Grace noticed him then. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly. She stood quickly, helping Ethan adjust his position. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, I didn't know you were back." Richard stepped inside. "Clearly," he replied, his voice tinged with something even he couldn't define: suspicion. "Maybe? What's going on here?" Ethan beamed at him. "Dad, Grace was reading me a story about a pirate who can't swim. It's so funny." Grace smiled gently at Ethan's excitement. "We were just having a little fun before dinner," she explained. But Richard's mind was racing. He had always kept a clear line between employer and employee. This felt personal. Too personal. And in a quiet, uncomfortable corner of his mind, there was a voice whispering an ugly, unexamined prejudice, one that made him question why his black maid was sitting there with his son, as though they were family. Trying to shake the thought, he told Ethan he'd be right back and motioned for Grace to follow him into the hallway. Once the door closed behind them, his tone hardened. "Grace, I hired you to take care of the house, not to play games." Her posture straightened. "With respect, Mr. Hale, you also asked me to make sure Ethan was cared for. Sometimes that means more than just making sure he eats and takes his medication. He needs companionship. He needs to feel loved." Richard bristled. "That's my job, as his father." "Then be here to do it," she replied softly, without malice, but with a firmness that caught him off guard. Her words stung because they were true. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked away, telling himself he needed to think. Over the next 2 days, Richard quietly observed. He saw Grace feeding Ethan with patience he'd never had. He saw her teaching him how to draw with colored pencils, encouraging him when his hands shook. He saw her carry him out into the garden so he could feel the sun on his face. And each time, Ethan's joy was palpable. By Sunday evening, Richard found himself lingering in the doorway again, watching as Grace and Ethan worked together on a puzzle. It struck him then, Ethan didn't just see Grace as the maid. He saw her as someone who cared, someone who filled the lonely spaces his father's absence left behind. After Ethan went to bed, Richard called Grace into his study. He poured himself a drink and gestured for her to sit. "I owe you an apology," he began. "When I walked in Friday, I jumped to conclusions. I've been so wrapped up in work that I haven't seen how much you've done for Ethan. You've been more than an employee. You've been family." Grace smiled faintly. "Ethan's a special boy. I don't see it as work. I see it as being there for someone who needs it." Richard nodded, a knot forming in his throat. "I can't change the fact that I'm away so much, but I can make sure you have whatever you need to keep making him feel this way." From that day forward, Richard saw Grace differently. Not as the black maid, not as staff, but as a person whose kindness had given his son something priceless. And for the first time in a long time, he felt grateful in a way money couldn't buy. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and moving stories. Share this video with friends or family who could use a reminder of the impact kindness can have, and leave a comment below telling us what part of this story resonated most with you. Your thoughts and support help keep these stories